Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 62. This is 7.3, the Spanish-American War, and our theme is America in the World. We have one learning objective for today, that is explain the effects of the Spanish-American War. So there is only one key concept, and it only talks about the effects as the learning objective suggests. So I wanted to make sure that you had some background into the Spanish-American War before we talk about the effects. So the causes of the war include the Cuban independence movement, which was being put down by the Spanish, who were the imperial power. They sent General Valeriano the Butcher Weyler. He gets the nickname the Butcher because he's putting people into concentration camps. There's also the growth of American jingoism. This is a new style of nationalism that's becoming quite common around the world, which includes an aggressive foreign policy. We have sensationalist yellow journalism in the United States. We have the newspaper wars between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and they're trying to outsell each other by coming up with more and more sensational headlines. So Hearst thought that it would be a good idea to have a war because then he could sell more newspapers. He sent a photographer down to Cuba and told him that you provide the pictures and I'll provide the war. And then finally, the main catalyst for the war is the sinking of the USS Maine. It was off the coast of Havana in Cuba, and there is an explosion. It was likely an accident, the boiler that blew up. But it was blamed on Spain by the newspapers, and so therefore William McKinley declares war on Spain. Now, because the United States is coming to the rescue on Cuba's behalf, obviously the fighting would begin in the Philippines, in the Pacific Ocean. Admiral John Dewey happens to be in Hong Kong. The Philippines were a Spanish holding, and he defeats the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila Bay. With the help of the Filipinos, they also win some land battles, which are going to keep the Spanish Navy from making its way over to the United States or making their way over to Cuba. The United States has a naval advantage going into this from all of the ships that Teddy Roosevelt had purchased or commissioned when he was Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and they overwhelm the Spanish Navy in Cuba, and they surrender after 3 months. William McKinley later calls the Spanish-American War a splendid little war because it only lasted such a short amount of time. The most recognizable land battle is the Battle of San Juan Hill. It was led by Teddy Roosevelt on the American side and his Rough Riders. More casualties in this war came from disease than from the fighting. All right, so now we can move on to our key concept, and that is the American victory in the Spanish-American War led to the U.S. acquisition of island territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, an increase in involvement in Asia, and the suppression of a nationalist movement in the Philippines. So we'll go through each of these effects one by one. We'll start with the acquisition of island territories. So this was finalized in the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which ended the war, even though the fighting had ended in August. The United States gets Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and they pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. However, Cuba is going to remain independent because in the declaration of war, there was an amendment called the Teller Amendment that said that Cuba would not become a part of the United States after the military conflict. Now, because the United States has more overseas holdings and they are on separate parts of the world, one in the Atlantic Ocean or the Caribbean and the other in the Pacific Ocean, it would benefit the United States to first have a way to get ships from one place to the other quickly, which leads to the United States getting the Panama Canal built. And two, they're going to need a faster and better Navy. So this is where Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet of ships comes in. So he reinvests more money into the Navy. You can see Teddy Roosevelt on the bottom right there when he's visiting the Panama Canal construction, sitting in a large crane operator. On the left, you see that the two different views of America's involvement in the Spanish-American War. On the top left, you see the Spanish interpretation that Uncle Sam is clawing up all of the different territories that are around him. And in the bottom left, you see that the Spanish are torturing the Cubans and Lady Liberty is reaching out for them while Uncle Sam is hiding from the reality of the world. All right, so now we're moving on to increased involvement in Asia. This is mainly due to the holding of the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean. It allows the United States to have closer economic relations with China. But because at the time China had been split up into spheres of influence by the European powers, the United States had to go in there and come up with a policy in which they would not lose influence, yet at the same time avoid war with the European powers. And so this is where the open door policy comes in. So the Secretary of State, John Hay, basically tells all of the European powers that they're all going to share the markets in China and that no one is going to fight about it, that they are better to join forces than to try and fight each other on this. The Chinese, for their part, did not appreciate having outsiders inside of their country, forcing them to trade. So in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion starts to try and expel the foreigners, and it is put down by a multinational military force, of which the United States was a part of. Additionally, we have Teddy Roosevelt mediating the peace in the Russo-Japanese War, which is being fought over territories in Northern Korea and Manchuria. And we also negotiate what's called the Gentleman's Agreement over discrimination in the United States. There were some discriminatory laws in the state of California that were keeping Japanese immigrants from going to the same schools as other Americans. And because Japan is becoming a industrial imperial power, Teddy Roosevelt doesn't want to make them angry. So they come up with this agreement in which the state of California is going to repeal those discriminatory laws, and the Japanese government was going to try and discourage more Japanese immigrants from going to the United States. All right, and then the final effect here, we have the suppression of an independence movement in the Philippines. So Emilio Aguinaldo, who had fought with the United States against Spain in the Spanish-American War, was discouraged that after the end of the war, the United States would not grant the Philippines their independence. So he starts to lead attacks on the United States after that denial. He's leading guerrilla-style tactics against the United States, hitting them quickly and then reverting back. Eventually, the United States is going to be successful in putting down this insurrection or this independence movement with about 20,000 Filipino war casualties, so people who were actually fighting in the war, and up to 1 million civilian casualties who have died of famine, cholera, and other diseases. Now, to make matters worse, the United States would not grant the Philippines, now a U.S. territory, the same rights that one would have if they had been born or living inside of the continental United States, meaning that the Bill of Rights did not apply to these new overseas holdings. The Supreme Court of the United States decided this in a series of cases called the Insular Cases, that Congress needed to actively create legislation that was going to grant these rights to the overseas territories. Eventually, Congress does so in the Woodrow Wilson administration with the 1916 Jones Act for the Philippines. It grants Filipinos rights, it grants them suffrage, it creates territorial legislatures, you see there in the bottom right, and it lays the path to independence. But that path to independence is interrupted by the World Wars. So it won't be until the 1940s where the Philippines are given their independence. And that was it. So here's our recap. So the Spanish-American War was the U.S. debut as an imperial power. The acquisitions in the Pacific lead to a greater involvement in Chinese and Japanese affairs, and despite the moral reasons for going to war with Spain, the United States suppresses an independence movement in the Philippines. All right, well, thank you for watching. Please come back for the next lecture in which we will talk about the progressives. See you then.